If you could kind of go through, maybe the only other question I have is if you could go through a step by step of what are all the things that you have to do when you're buying a house, as far as like inspections, appraisals, all of that kind of stuff. And what is the order that those usually take place in? I'm curious to know about some of that.
Yeah, so ideally, and this is how I like to work, is before you buy, you need to meet with a lender. You need to figure out what you can spend and then what you want to spend, because often that's different based on payments and whatnot. Um, and find out, okay, I'm officially pre-approved for X amount of dollars. And then at that point, I like to meet with the buyer. They have their price point established. They know how high they'd feel comfortable going. Um, and that's when I meet and I will go over the criteria that they would like to have for a home, their wants and needs based on that budget. And at that point, I set them up on a search. That's the part where you look. That's the fun part everybody wants to do. But doing those first two steps, I think, is really important to kind of explain the market, the current market situation, whether it's the same as it is now or different. What's involved in the process. Actually explaining this process to someone is part of my buyer's presentation because I believe that it's important to know what you're getting into before you're looking at a home and you're faced with the question, do you want to buy this home? You kind of need to know what that means, what all is going to be involved. On a typical purchase agreement, and I say typical because there's obviously different things that you can write in and different terms you can offer. But in a typical purchase agreement, if the buyer is needing a mortgage, there's going to be several things. Title work is really important. I always say in hurdles, okay? There's three hurdles, if you will. Title work is one of those. It makes sure that the property in question is, in fact, the seller's and that they have the right to sell it to you. And it also ensures that when you purchase that home, once it's yours, it's free and clear of any liens or judgments that that seller may have incurred, or even the previous owner, or it goes back all the way to when it was originally platted. And that way you don't have somebody coming in and say, hey, this is my house, or have any nasty surprises about, oh, you owe all this money because this debt is attached to this property that you now own. So that's one hurdle that I say needs to be satisfied before you can make that purchase. Usually there's not too many issues with that, but that's why you look at it. You just want to make sure because the last thing you want is to spend thousands more than you thought and have no ability to get out of the contract when it comes up if the seller's not willing to take care of that. The other things that are maybe more common, inspection is another part of it where basically, you've already agreed on a sale price and you believe that that is a fair price for the home, and so does the seller. But then you get an inspector like Andy or somebody in there that finds some flaws that you didn't know about, that the seller didn't even know about. And now, instead of saying, oh man, that house is worth this much, you say, well, now that I know about these issues, I know the house to be worth less. And that's a good thing because, the seller is generally going to be unaware of these items. And it's going to be a surprise to them. And a lot of times I have sellers that feel bad. Oh man, I didn't know that was wrong. If I would have known it was wrong, it would have been fixed already. So at that point, it's a renegotiation of sorts where the buyer is saying, hey, I need these issues either corrected or I need an adjustment on the price or something like that to satisfy the things that need done to the property to make it what I thought it was. And the third one I'd say is the appraisal. That's when the bank appraiser, and the appraiser does represent the bank, to ensure that the property is worth what it's selling for, contracted sale price. So if that appraiser comes in, for instance, we'll use $100,000 as an example. If that appraiser comes in and says that the property is worth 110,000, then the buyer will be very happy about that because that means they've gotten a deal essentially. If the appraiser comes in and says that it's worth 100,000, that's also fine. That means that they're paying a fair price for it. And the seller doesn't always find out what the appraisal came in as, but the seller is generally pretty happy with an appraisal coming right in at value because they essentially sold it for exactly what it's worth, um, the maximum. So the problem potentially is when an appraiser will come in and say the house is only worth 90,000 instead of the sale price of 100. At that point, what would happen is the bank is only going to lend based on the 90,000 instead of the 100,000. So the buyer will be to continue with the transaction as written. The buyer would have to come up with their down payment percentage of 90,000, and additionally, they would have to bring $10,000 essentially in cash to make up the difference between 90 and 100. Many times that's not a possibility for a seller, and it's usually not ideal either, because officially you are paying more for the house than it is worth. So that's a hard thing for a lot of people to stomach. And right now we are seeing quite a few transactions where it's written into the contract that the buyer agrees to pay a certain amount of dollars over appraisal cut if that is a situation that comes up. That is something that each buyer, in their own comfort level, can decide to do or not. But they need to know that when they're doing this and they're offering those terms, they are officially agreeing to pay over what that home is worth if that appraisal is cut. So officially in the contract, in a normal situation, the buyer and the seller would perhaps negotiate that. Many times the buyer is unwilling or unable to come up with extra funds to close that sale. So a lot of times the seller will come down to that appraised value if it's not disputed. Other times maybe there will be some sort of meet in the middle type of negotiation. So it just it does give the right to walk away to the buyer if that appraisal is cut, because you can't really force somebody to overpay for something. That's the reason for that. And so once you get through those conditions, and of course once your loan is finalized in that process, then you can go to the closing. That's generally you'll get like a final walkthrough to make sure that the repair items were completed to your satisfaction, make sure that the seller didn't gouge up all the walls when they were moving out. And then at that point, you go to closing and get the keys, and that's all said and done at that point.